Today on Independent Wrestling Profiles, we're talking with the Last Action star, Clash Kincade.
When did you first discover professional wrestling as an entity?
It would have been way back in the good old days of the WWF. Some of my youngest memories are probably of seeing, Hogan and Ultimate Warrior and those guys. The first action figures that I had as a kid were LJN rubber wrestlers, and I had Hogan and Kamala and Mean Gene, and I'm talking probably 3-4 years old, and then some very early memories of watching. I guess it would have probably been Saturday Night Main Event at the time. So that would have been my first introduction to pro wrestling, very much centered around Hogan.
So how does a 3-year-old get exposed to that? Was it something that you did with siblings, cousins, family members? Did you just happen to stumble upon it flicking channels, and were you hooked right away? Or was it something that it wasn't until later in life that you kind of developed a personal interest in it?
Well, I think originally it would have probably been something that my parents would have probably just put on, sat me in front of the TV and turned it on and figured, oh, cool, this will entertain him or whatever, right? And same thing with those early LJN figures. Not a lot of small pieces or choking hazards or anything, right? It's just these big rubber dudes. But in the following years, I definitely did have some cousins that were really into it. They were all a little bit older than me, and they were really into wrestling, magazine subscriptions and stuff like that. They had the figures, they had the old VHS tapes of the old Manias, SummerSlam, and the magazine subscriptions and everything. So my cousins kind of exposed me a little bit even more to wrestling. And I knew that they were just very into it. And I remember even as, a really young child borrowing the VHS tapes from them, borrowing plastic bags full of their LJN figures, flipping through the magazines. So they definitely kind of had, they were a bit more, I don't really want to say hardcore wrestling fans, but they were definitely more into it. And that might have just been because of the age difference. They were a few years older than me, right? So they really got me more into it. And then as I was growing up, it was kind of, we were going into the new generation era, right? Because Hogan would have been kind of the first real kind of wrestling superstar that I really remember seeing. Hogan and Ultimate Warrior really stood out to me. But then as soon as Brett and Shawn kind of started to, sort of take the spotlight, my attention was definitely shifted to those guys. These guys just seem I don't know, a little cooler, a little more hip, younger, more athletic. So yeah, I definitely owe it to my cousins to kind of I would say, yeah, it's partly their fault that I ended up being such a big wrestling fan. Yeah, for sure.
It's crazy that we're a little bit of an older generation, so we had to go to things like VHSs. People don't realize how accessible wrestling is nowadays. We had to work for it back in the day.
Yeah.
Do you happen to recall any of the performers at that time, whether it was the initial ones or even the new generation ones, that really kind of inspired you or motivated you, or even now that you kind of have gotten into the industry, look back and think, oh, okay, well, I actually did formulate a lot of who I became just kind of based on their existence and their influence?
I mean, Hogan always seemed just larger than life, the personality. And then the thing that kind of drew me to Ultimate Warrior is that I'm a huge Conan the Barbarian fan, and Ultimate Warrior was basically a pro wrestling version of Conan the Barbarian. And being a huge action movie guy, my favorites when I was younger were always Schwarzenegger, Van Damme, Stallone. But Van Damme was probably my favorite one, just because he seemed to do kind of flashier moves and stuff like that. So when I found out about Shawn Michaels, and I was actually talking to someone the other day about this, and it was like my cousin told me, because I had asked them, oh, like what's like Shawn Michaels' finishing move? And he was like, oh, it's a super kick. And I was like, whoa, like what, really? Like how? And he was like, oh, he kicks the guy like right in the face. And I was thinking like, whoa, like you can do that in wrestling? You can kick someone in the face? So Shawn Michaels really stood out to me because he was like kind of bridging that gap between like really old school grappling pro wrestling and then like a bit more like martial artsy type stuff. Like, I mean, a kick to the face, is it like it's all basically some type of karate kick or savate kick or whatever you might hear people call it that now. So that to me was like, whoa, like you can do stuff like that in wrestling. So that really stood out to me.
Well, I definitely want to touch on the action movie star stuff later, but I want to kind
Yeah.
of get into the journey a little bit more first.
Sure.
When was it in that journey that you actually started to think maybe in the back of your mind, this is something that I might want to be involved in?
Well, I mean, very early on, I would have been kind of like starstruck, just seeing how cool that these characters and personalities were. So I definitely would kind of fantasize about what it would be like, to be a wrestler. And not long after did my cousins and I kind of, start wrestling in the backyard and kind of trying to start our own backyard thing. Mind you, I was like, like 10, 11, 12 years old back then. But it didn't really strike me as something to actually try to do because to me, it always seemed very inaccessible. Like I didn't know how it worked. I didn't know that there were wrestling schools in the same way that there's like, boxing gyms and karate dojos and stuff. I didn't know that that's how it worked. I thought you had to go through some much more complicated process that was a lot less accessible. So it was kind of just always a fantasy for me until much later in life.
Yeah, little did they know that those "don't try this at home" warnings had literally no impact on anybody.
Yeah, I'd like to see you stop me.
So take me through the trigger event. You say it wasn't until much later. So where were you in life when you just decided, okay, I'm going to look into this? Maybe there are schools. Like what actually caused you to take that step into the wrestling world?
Kind of had like wrestling was always yeah, like kind of something that I would fantasize about, that I was very entertained by. And then I kind of like in my teen years I got into music and playing in bands and stuff like that. And then I kind of didn't really watch wrestling that much, and I sort of did the music thing for years, played for a couple of different bands. And this is back when I lived in Nova Scotia. But then when I moved to Ontario, that's when I started to see much more advertising for, like indie wrestling, local wrestling shows. Social media was starting to pick up with like Instagram, not just Facebook, but like Instagram and stuff like that. And that's how I first found out about the school that I ended up training at, was through Instagram, was through seeing posts from Superkicked, which is where I started Superkicked Pro training. And like at the time, I was sort of just like dipping my toes back into like the wrestling fandom. It kind of started by me playing the video games. I think it was like 2K15 or 17, I think, was out at the time. And I just thought, oh, what the hell? This will be something fun to play with some of the boys, just have a laugh at. And that kind of reminded me of just how awesome wrestling was. And then I remember just one night, like I was just browsing YouTube and I was like, you know what? I'm going to look up an old match and watch it. So I rewatched Shawn Michaels versus Razor Ramon, the ladder match from WrestleMania 10, and like I was just like blown away by how awesome it was, because I kind of hadn't taken a look at wrestling in a few years, and I was just like, holy, like this is just so cool and like awesome and hilarious and just like I just loved it. And then I was kind of like, okay, well, I'm going to keep watching some wrestling and kind of like really going back to that, like, whatever clips or matches I could find from like the Attitude Era and stuff like that, because that's like that would have been the height of my fandom as a kid would have been when I was like, 12, 13 ish. And it would have been, like the Attitude Era at that point, the Generation X, Steve Austin, The Rock. Like that was the stuff that really, really, really got me into it. Right. So anyway, when I started kind of like revisiting these classic moments and matches, and I just so happened to have had not the best luck with my musical endeavors. Like every band that I was jamming with or playing with, the kind of like fizzled out, or we would break up, or like whatever. And I was getting more and more into just working out. And I had even started doing some MMA training. I bought a heavy bag, which I was beating up, and like just getting into weightlifting and stuff like that, which at first was just kind of like for health reasons, you know what I mean? Like I just wanted to stay in shape. But then when I found out about wrestling training, I was like, oh, well, that'd be like a really good reason to stay in shape and like an extra motivator. And, coming from a musical background, like I love to entertain people. I love to be on stage. I love to be in the spotlight. So then I thought, oh, well, wrestling could be fun because then I'm kind of combining the athletic and the workout stuff. I'm kind of combining that with the showmanship. It's the perfect thing to get into. So that's how I found myself drawn to pro wrestling. And once I saw those ads online from Superkick that was like, oh, live your dream, like sign up now, become a pro wrestler, I was like, damn, like I really want to do this. And a couple of weeks after that, I signed up.
All right, so take me through some of those first few days or weeks at Superkicked. How were your first reactions to actual training? Were there things that you maybe weren't necessarily ready for? Were there parts that kind of came naturally to you? Like, just kind of how did it feel to actually be putting that dream into motion?
Well, it was very awesome. It's a very positive experience, and I was starting off at a good point. Like I was already in good shape and hitting the gym and stuff like that. So I've always also kind of been pretty naturally sort of acrobatic and like fairly athletic. So when it came to running the ropes, doing rolls, doing like flips, bumping and stuff like that. And bumping was also very, very much like a jujitsu or judo, like break fall. So I had been taking MMA and already, and then I was kind of like, I could see the correlation, so the first few weeks of training, I was doing very good. I was doing very good. And it really allowed me to like build up some momentum mentally in thinking like, okay, like I can really do this. Right when I started, I think I started at a really good point because I didn't have any trouble getting into the rolling or the hitting the ropes or the bumping or anything like that. All that stuff came pretty naturally to me. I more so hit like a bump in the road when we got into the kind of more technical side of things, like chain wrestling or hold to hold and all the reversals and stuff like that. But yeah, like those first few weeks were just really good. And one thing that I will always remember was just the amazing positivity and like camaraderie between like the other students. You know what I mean? It's like we just kind of all wanted the same thing. We're all learning together. And although training was very tough at times, we were all kind of like there to support each other and help each other out. And I remember thinking in my head, even after those first few weeks, that even if I didn't want to like pursue wrestling, that just having that sort of community would have been enough to keep me going back to training anyway, because that was just a really positive, cool thing to be a part of.
That sounds like great motivation for when you do hit those bumps in the road to kind of keep you moving forward. So eventually you must have had your first match, right? That happened because you're well past that now. Take me through
Yeah.
that first experience that you had getting in the ring for an actual match.
When I did have my first training match, I felt like that was sort of delayed because at the time the management or the trainers from Superkick, there was kind of a shift in like who was working together. Like when I started, it was with Chris Chambers and Ashley Six, and then Ashley Six ended up leaving, and that kind of like, I don't know if the students' progress was maybe being like kept track of in books or something. I'm not sure how they were keeping track of things, but it kind of seemed like when Ashley Six left, that like there was kind of this transition period, right? And I was kind of in limbo there where I felt like I was at the point where I was going to be doing my first training match. But then because of the switchover and like the management or whatever it was, it kind of like got delayed. So for a few months, I kind of just, kept on training, and it felt like I was just never going to get asked to do that first training match. But eventually the day came, and I did do my first training match, and I'm trying to remember who it was with. I think he's still with Super Kicked now. It's he calls himself Slam Campbell. Yeah, it's Sam. Well, I guess Sam Campbell, but yeah, he calls himself Slam Campbell, and he's still with Super Kicked now. And I remember he had only been there for like I was like something like 5 months in, and he might have been like 1 or 2 months in. And I'm pretty sure my first training match was with him. I definitely underestimated how tough it was to actually go through a match. Not just physically, but the piecing it together and making it make sense, the mental aspect of it, and like because you don't want to have to remember what to do. You want things to be like in muscle memory. But I was still at a point where I had to be like, oh, like remember to sell, oh, remember to move to this part of the ring and that. So that was the really challenging part. You know what I mean? So it was kind of humbling because I was like, damn, like I totally underestimated this. Like this is going to be, it's going to take some more work. But it was fun. It was a good experience. It was definitely like just a wake up call that, like, oh yeah, well the pros make it look easy, just like anything else. You watch Zach Wild or Van Halen shred a solo. It looks easy, right? But it's got to put in work. So wrestling, just like everything else, it's definitely hard to master, and I still have a long way to go before I do master it as well. But it was great. It was a lot of fun, and it was a wake up call, and it definitely made me just respect the sport even more because I was realizing how hard you have to work to get good at it.
So let's talk character work a little bit. I've been waiting from the start here to ask you about the birth of the Last Action Star. Now, I'm an 80s kid. I grew up with all the Arnold movies, the Van Damme movies, the Stallone movies, and things like
Hell
that.
yeah.
And the first exposure I had to you was just like a promo I saw on Instagram. And it might have even been like an edited poster of like Last Action Hero. And I was just
Yeah.
like, this guy makes me want to stand up and take notice.
Yeah, thank you.
We talk about that in the industry, like the it factor and the character work and things like that. So take me through the birth of the Last Action Star.
Well, I mean, originally when I started, I always had the name. I always had Clash Kincade, but I didn't exactly know who Clash Kincade was supposed to be. My first year or so of taking bookings, I was just Clash Kincade, and I thought that maybe I would take it in this sort of medieval like direction. Like I used to always think that like I'd get like like one of those chainmail vests like Triple H would wear or whatever. And like my first couple of logos and stuff had like swords in it and stuff like that. But it never really hit the nail on the head for what I wanted to do. And then it was only actually after the lockdowns, because the lockdowns happened and I kind of, well, nothing was happening. Very few shows were happening. Training wasn't happening. And I kind of just like stopped doing everything for over a year. But then when I got back into it, when the lockdowns were done and everything was kind of going back to normal and shows were happening again, training was happening again, then it was kind of like I had a nice long break where my brain could kind of just, think about other stuff. So then when I went back to thinking about wrestling and I started thinking about my character, it just hit me. And when it hit me, it was like so obvious that this is what I wanted to do. Because I was just thinking, like, who do I really want to be? Like, what do I actually want to do? And around that time, I had watched this action movie parody called Kung Fury.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever seen
Oh,
Kung
I
Fury.
know it.
Yeah, yeah. So when I saw Kung Fury, like I'd actually seen it a few times, like it didn't hit me right away the first time I saw it. When I first saw it, I was just like, "Oh, this is so awesome! This is so funny! Like I love this character, and I love the action movie references and everything." And then one day, I was going to train in Hamilton. At this point, I was training with Rip Impact in Hamilton, and while I was on the Go train, I had my notepad and stuff, and then I was just like, "Whoa!" Like that Kung Fury character, like that action, like an action movie character, and I was like, "Oh, well, what would I call a character like that?" And right away it came to me, oh, the Last Action Star. And I was just like, whoa, like I think I'm on to something, because I could feel it like in my heart. If anybody's going to play this character, it's got to be me. Like there ain't no way I'm letting anyone else out there do this. Like I just felt like I was just so drawn to it. And like a lot of ideas came to my head. Like I was thinking Kung Fury, I was thinking like Johnny Cage from Mortal Kombat. I was thinking all the classic action movie characters, like like Rambo, Dutch from Predator, all that stuff. And then I was kind of looking at pictures of Kung Fury, and it was like the red headband and stuff. That's where I got the idea for the red headband. But then once I tried it on, I was like, oh man, like why don't I add like dog tags, and I had this bullet belt kicking around from my like heavy metal days. A lot of metal heads would wear bullet belts, right? And I hadn't used this belt in forever. And I was like, whoa, like the bullet belts, like the bullet belt, the dog tags, and the headband, that's going to seem like Rambo. And then I just add the sunglasses for the star factor, for that Johnny Cage factor. And right away, the first time that I thought of that, I just put it on, and I took like a short video of just myself just kind of posing. And I was like, this is it. I don't care what anybody says. I am doing this character. I am going to be the Last Action Star. And it just felt very right, because I feel like the Last Action Star is who I just like truly wish that I was in real life. You know what I mean? And my trainers, when I was getting, trained at Super Kicks, Chris Chambers always told us, take your personality and dial it up to 11. So for me, that very much means the same thing as, dig deep into what you truly want to be and wish that you are, and just crank that up. And that's what you get for me.
I wore this shirt on purpose because the Rad soundtrack has "Thunder in Your
Oh,
Heart"
yes,
on
exactly.
it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Fantastic.
totally. Yeah. I didn't even notice that. Oh
Uh,
man, I love
uh,
that song.
why don't you toss out a couple 80s, 90s action movie recommendations for me? I'll put you on the spot here.
Well, I mean, I've always I've always really, really loved Showdown in Little Tokyo
Nice.
with Dolph Lundgren and Brandon Lee. Like it's such a perfect like 90s action movie. It's not very long. It doesn't like drag on at all. It's like a 90-minute movie, or even less. I think it's like 126 minutes or something like that. So sorry, what am I saying? 126
Hour and
minutes
26
longer.
minutes.
Yeah, an hour and 26 minutes. Um uh but yeah, like it's a quick, fun, like in and out, bang, some good one-liners, some great action scenes. Two buddy cops fighting the yakuza who are putting like opium or just some kind of drugs in beer or whatever. It's like, it's just really, really good. And I really love that movie. It's not one that gets mentioned like too often when it comes to like 80s, 90s action movies. But yeah, I love that movie. Time Cop, Van Damme's Time Cop, hour and a half ish. It does not drag on in the third act at all. It's just kind of like, okay, we're building up to the climax. Here's the fight. That's the end of the movie. So I love that movie. People will give Steven Seagal a lot of crap, but like Under Siege, the first Under Siege, I mean, it's got Tommy Lee Jones, it's got Gary Busey. I think like Gary Busey is one of the best guys that you can cast as a villain in action movies. Speaking of Gary Busey, Predator 2, I think, is very underrated. If you take the plot for Predator 2, and it's like there's like this Colombian Jamaican like drug war going on in Los Angeles, and then you've got, Danny Glover as this hard-boiled, like detective cop kind of guy. And then you have Gary Busey in there as like this kind of like, corporate scumbag and stuff. It's like the movie's already awesome, even without the Predator. Like the plot for Predator 2 would like that movie would have been great on its own, and then you add in the Predator. So I think that that's a very underrated action movie. I know it's got like a sci-fi twist in it too, but I love Predator 2. I think it's so good. And like sometimes I almost want to say that I like it better than the first one. And like the first one is a classic, but like it Predator 2 is just such a great example of like your rated R like early 90s action movie. So what do we
That's
got here? Showdown in Little Tokyo, Time Cop, Under Siege, Predator 2. There's got to be another good one I can mention here. Not one that gets mentioned too often. Red Heat with Schwarzenegger and Jim Belushi.
yeah.
Yeah, like that movie just does not get mentioned very often when you talk about Arnold's classics, but it's again a buddy cop dynamic. Some really good, funny one-liners in that one. And it's got a really cool, like, because it starts off in Russia, Soviet Union, and then you go to the United States. I'm pretty sure it's Los Angeles. Red Heat's, in my opinion, another just underrated late 80s, early 90s action movie.
Nice. So just stepping back into the wrestling world again, I want to ask you, what are some particular highlights or OMG moments that you might have had in your career so far?
In after 2022, I started doing like a lot of fair shows, whether it be for like, Taco Fest or like so and so's towns, spring fair or summer fair or fall fair. Maybe I can't pick like one specific moment. Well, I guess I kind of could actually, because it was the second year that I did the London Taco Fest, which is promoted by Demand Lucha. When you take wrestling with wrestling fans at regular like indie shows, like that's awesome, that's great. But then when you put wrestling in front of a non-wrestling crowd, it's really amazing the effect that it has because everyone just gets drawn to it. Some of those shows had really big crowds, and yeah, like the last time that I had done the London Taco Fest, it was just like, I mean, definitely over 500 people,
Wow.
all just crammed around the ring. We did, I did a singles match because I think we only had like 4 or 6 workers or something like that for this weekend. I did a singles match, and then it was like later in the night there was going to be like another singles match where one of the heels comes and interferes, and then it turns into a tag match, which
Okay.
is like a classic recipe for fair shows. And it was me and Chili Brown against Ethan Dukes and Chad Money Mills. And this tag match that we had in London was like lightning in a bottle. It was just like we didn't do anything fancy or crazy. It was a super super simple tag match, but everyone was just so into it. And I remember once we won that match, there was like no transition between the end of the wrestling show and the start of the salsa dancing or whatever it was. It was like the the victory celebration was the start of the salsa dancing. Like it became a party. As soon as the match was won, that whole place became a party. People were jumping into the ring and dancing. Everyone was celebrating. I'm pretty sure I had some drunk Mexican guy like telling me he loved me or something like that. And like it was just really great. So I would say that was a really good moment for me to just realize how powerful wrestling can be and how amazing it can be, even to people who aren't wrestling fans, how it just can bring people together and create that sort of celebration. Also, I would have to mention it was around this time last year that I worked a show for OEW, Ontario Elite Wrestling. It was me against Aiden Prince. So he's awesome. I'm pretty sure he's signed to TNA, and he's an incredible worker. So for me to have a match with someone who's signed to TNA, who I'm pretty sure he might have been X Division champion, I think, but he's very very good. So to have had a match with him, and it wasn't like a super big crowd or anything like that, but it was definitely a highlight for me just to be able to get into the ring with him. I recently had a really good match with Johnny DeLuca for Demand Lucha. So I've always done Demand Luchas like Taco Fest, Tequila Expo, kind of like their fair shows. But this was my first time working on their main show for the Breakout division, which is kind of like a gimmick where the fans vote for like who they want to come back. So it was me versus DeLuca, rightfully so. DeLuca, I won the match, but he won the votes. And you know what? Like I'm totally okay with that because he is very, very good. He's so good. He's just like so snappy and quick with everything, and he's very, very good. And it was great to be able to wrestle in downtown Toronto for Demand Lucha. For the last couple of like year or so, I kind of do this thing where I'll stomp the ring and then clap my hands and get the crowd to start chanting action, right?
Okay.
So it's like action, action, and then usually everyone kind of joins in, right? So I didn't say action or anything, but I did end up stomping the ring at the start of my match, and then to my surprise, the crowd did the action chant. So I'd gotten like a pretty decent pop on my entrance. Like when I watched it back, I was like, whoa, like the crowd's like behind me. They're like they know who I am, and to just hear a crowd in downtown Toronto doing the action chant without me leading them into it. Like yes, I stomped my foot, but I didn't say the words. They already knew what was coming. So that was a really cool moment. And then I have to also mention. I don't have this title anymore, but when I won the Durham Regional Championship for GCW, that was very, very awesome because I feel like this area like Oshawa, Durham region, there is a lot of like wrestling promotions that come through here. There's never been really truly been a proper wrestling school here. And I've always felt like me and kind of like my friends and stuff, like we're just kind of like, the rest of the wrestling scene is kind of like, you have Toronto, you have Hamilton, and they all have schools and stuff like that. And then Oshawa's kind of been on its own. So like it felt cool to become Durham regional champion just to have like to represent the wrestlers from this area who kind of never really had a sort of a home. you know
Then where would you like to see your career go next?
well, for the last little bit I've been saying that I would like to make it to TNA, and I've been saying this since before TNA's been crossing over with NXT. So now it seems like that bar is even set even higher.
Yeah.
There's so much good talent in TNA. And maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like TNA, especially with this crossover with WWE, NXT, are surpassing AEW. I don't know. It just seems like the talent that they're bringing in from TNA, their names seem to hold more weight now. Like we have Jordan Grace, Moose just debuted on there. I think there's a few others who are crossing over.
The Hardy Boys were just on a couple times.
Right. Yeah, yeah. The
Yeah.
Hardys, and like they're actively showing the TNA logo and the TNA championships on NXT, on WWE, which is on Netflix, so you can't you can't really beat that. So yeah, I would like to see myself in TNA. There's a lot of other wrestlers who I know who have worked with TNA or who are signed to TNA. It would be really cool to end up there. If not, I mean, my goal has always kind of been to just at least get to a level where I'm an established indie wrestler, and if I can make, a living off of doing this, if I can get to a point where I can at least have a bit of demand, some notoriety to myself, a good reputation, where I can get to a point where I can charge a reasonable rate, or where people will want to spend the money to fly me here or fly me there or whatever, right? Like I'm not trying to get rich off this or anything, but if I can survive doing this, that's really kind of been the goal. And then if I can make it to TNA, I would very much kind of have my sights set on that. Yeah.
Okay, so I have to do the very cliche wrestling interviewer thing and ask you the question, who's the dream opponent?
Dream opponent. Oh man.
Let's stick with people that are actively competing because we don't want to open it up to history.
Yeah,
But
right.
you don't have to justify it, how it would happen, where it would happen, but who would be the dream opponent that still laced them up today?
Since I play, like an action star character, I really like it when I'm facing an opponent who seems like they could be a villain in an action movie. I've known him for a while. I've never worked with him, but Shogun, Jackson Stone, I mean, that would be a badass villain for an action movie. Like this just huge monster of a man who wears, this samurai shogun mask, and I'm pretty sure he's heel right now, too. I could be mistaken. But him as a heel against my character, I just feel like there's so much good kind of dynamic that we could have with each other in that regard. Also, he's one of the best in the country, if not in the world right now. But Speedball, Mike Bailey, also someone who I could see like he is very much a baby face, but like he has a very martial artsy kind of character and style. And again, I just think that like if there was, a comic book or a movie or something with Flash Kincade and he's against this like just martial arts freak, I think that there's just a lot of potential there. And I mean, okay, another guy who's like definitely heel at the moment, but Killer Cross or Karrion Cross, because he like maybe not so much an action movie villain. I mean, I could see him as an movie villain, but just a movie villain in general. Like he almost has this almost Tarantino-esque like criminal kind of vibe to him. You know what I mean? An underground gang leader type of character almost is what I get from him. I've always loved his work. I love his kind of like philosophy on certain things. Some of the posts that he makes are sometimes I feel like you kind of have to like read in between the lines to kind of know what he's saying. But he just has a really cryptic way of speaking, and it just like reminds me of like some kind of like dark like cult leader or something like that.
Yeah, like a mastermind pulling the strings behind the
E-
scenes kind of thing.
exactly,
Yeah,
and I was gonna say sort of like reminiscent of like the Night Slasher in Cobra with Stallone, right? Because he kind of has his whole underground gang thing and like we are the future and all that stuff. So like I kind of get that vibe from him, and I've just been a fan of him for a long time. So he would be another dream opponent for sure. Karrion Cross, yeah.
amazing. So the last thing that I like to ask everybody before we sign off is if you had an opportunity to go back and talk to a younger version of yourself, what piece of advice would you give yourself about getting into the wrestling industry?
Well, I mean, I would like to tell myself to start earlier, to start younger. And I know that, the way things kind of happened in my life, the circumstances, it just so happened that, I only really kind of started to see it as something, possible at all at a later state in my life. Like I started training when I was 29. I would have very much liked to have been able to start at like, 19 or 25 or something like that, right? So if I could go back and give myself advice, I'd be like, hey, just so you know, you're going to end up being a wrestler. So you should start training much earlier. That's one thing for sure. And same thing with like kind of discovering the action star character. Like I would tell myself, like, look, this is the character that you truly want to be. So let's take all the guesswork and the trial and error out of it and just let you know you're going to be the action star. So that's get to work on that right away.
Yeah, that bullet bill's been there the whole time.
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think that's the main thing would be really honestly, I would tell myself to start earlier because it would be really nice to have an extra 10 years, 5 to 10 years of experience to back me up, especially at this stage in my life. That would be very, very valuable because like it takes hundreds of reps, you know what I mean? I did a seminar with Rene Dupree once, and he said you got to wrestle 1,000 matches before you really start to get it. For me, like that's going to take a long time. You know what I mean? Like I'm probably just shy of about 300 matches now, so I got to keep going at a strong rate for many more years to get to 1,000, right? So if I would have started earlier, I'd be a lot closer to that number, you know?
Awesome. So before I sign out, can you just let everybody know once again who you are and maybe where they can find you online if they want to drop you a follow?
Absolutely. So it's Clash Kincade, the last action star. You can find out most of my upcoming matches, show dates, and a whole bunch of promos and wrestling footage, mainly on my Instagram, which is just Clash_Kincade. I do have a YouTube channel and there is a Facebook page, but the main hub of everything that I post is the Instagram. And, for anyone out there who's listening, who's checking this stuff out, my main stomping grounds are anywhere from, Toronto, Durham region, Peterborough. I have been working in Quebec a little bit here and there, but yeah. So if you are an Ontario indie wrestling fan and you've yet to see me, well, come on out to a show, and chances are sooner or later you will cross paths with the action star.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, man. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to Independent Wrestling Profiles. Please help out the show if you can with a like, subscription, or review. We'll see you next time.